I'm 68 years old now, and I've been keeping a secret that has defined every single day of my adult life. For the past 41 years, I've been meeting with the same unidentified craft in the Mojave Desert. Not once, not a handful of times. Regularly, predictably. Every 73 days, give or take a few hours, I drive to the same unmarked coordinates, and it comes. The occupants, whatever they are, have been communicating with me since October 1983. And what they finally told me about why they fear humanity is something I can no longer keep to myself. My name is Robert Carmichael. I'm a retired aerospace engineer. I spent 32 years working in propulsion systems, first at Edwards Air Force Base, then later at a private contractor I won't name. I have a degree from Caltech. I've published papers on hypersonic flight dynamics. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that I'm not prone to fantasy. I built my career on mathematics, physics, and empirical data. Everything I'm about to tell you goes against the rational framework I spent my entire professional life upholding. I know how this sounds. I've rehearsed this confession 1,000 times in my head, always imagining the skepticism, the dismissal, maybe even the pity. For 4 decades, that fear kept me silent. But I'm dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe 8, and I've realized that whatever judgment comes from telling this story is nothing compared to taking it to my grave. The meetings haven't stopped. Even now, even as my body fails, I still make the drive every 73 days. My last encounter was 11 days ago. I sat in my truck, oxygen tank beside me, and watched the craft descend in absolute silence, the same way it has hundreds of times before. The same lights, the same impossible movements, the same presence that has become more familiar to me than most human relationships in my life. They've never harmed me, never threatened me, but they've shown me things, communicated concepts that I'm still struggling to process years after receiving them. And in 2003, during what I thought would be a routine encounter, they answered a question I'd been afraid to ask for 20 years. Why do you stay hidden? What they told me changed everything I thought I understood about humanity's place in the universe. This isn't a story about benevolent space brothers or hostile invaders. It's more complicated than that, more unsettling. Because what they fear about us isn't our violence or our primitive nature. It's something fundamental to human consciousness itself, something we don't even recognize we possess. I've spent the last few weeks organizing 4 decades of encrypted journals, photographs of light patterns, sketches of the craft's geometry, mathematical sequences that appeared in my mind during encounters. I don't expect any of it to serve as proof. I learned a long time ago that this kind of experience doesn't translate into evidence that satisfies skeptics. But I need to document it anyway. I need to tell it exactly as it happened, because the beings made one thing clear in our recent communications. Humanity is approaching a threshold, a point of no return. And we need to understand what we are before we reach it. So this is my testimony. This is what happened to me, starting on a clear October night in 1983, when I was 27 years old and absolutely certain I understood how the universe worked. The autumn of 1983 found me in the high desert of California, working at Edwards Air Force Base as a junior aerospace engineer in the Propulsion Research Division. I'd graduated from Caltech the previous spring with a degree in aerospace engineering and a thesis on scramjet optimization that had earned me enough recognition to land this position. I was young, ambitious, and completely convinced that human engineering was on the verge of revolutionary breakthroughs in high-speed flight. Edwards was exactly where I wanted to be. The vast dry lake bed, the constant presence of experimental aircraft, the brilliant minds working on projects that pushed the boundaries of what was aerodynamically possible. I spent my days running computational models, analyzing test data, and occasionally getting to witness actual flight tests from the observation bunkers. It was everything I'd worked toward. October 14th, 1983 was a Thursday. I remember because we'd had a major test scheduled for that morning, a scramjet prototype mounted on a modified SR-71. The test had gone well, and I'd spent the afternoon processing the telemetry data in my office. By evening, most of the facility had cleared out. I was one of the last to leave, walking to my car in the parking lot around 8:47 p.m. I remember checking my watch because I was supposed to call my girlfriend, Amanda, before 9. The sky was exceptionally clear that night. No moon yet, just the sprawling canopy of stars that you only get in the desert, far from city lights. I'd stopped beside my car, keys in hand, just looking up. Growing up in Los Angeles, I'd never seen stars like the ones visible from Edwards. It was one of the small pleasures of working there. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a satellite, a bright point of light moving steadily across the sky from south to north. But then it stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Completely motionless against the background stars. I stood there, keys still in my hand, watching this light that had violated the first principle of orbital mechanics. Satellites don't stop. They can't stop. They're in constant freefall around the Earth. Then it moved again, but not in a straight line. It executed a perfect 90-degree turn. No arc, no curve. An instantaneous change of direction that would have generated G-forces that would pulverize any material we knew how to manufacture. My engineering mind immediately started calculating the acceleration required for that maneuver, the structural stresses, the energy expenditure. None of it made sense. I pulled out the small notebook I always carried and started documenting. Time, position relative to known stars, apparent magnitude, movement characteristics. The object performed 3 more impossible maneuvers over the next 4 minutes. A figure 8 pattern, another 90-degree turn, and then most remarkably it accelerated from a complete stop to disappearing over the horizon in what I estimated to be less than 2 seconds. I tried to calculate the velocity that would require and gave up. It was absurd. I stood in that parking lot for another 20 minutes, watching the sky, waiting to see if it would return. It didn't. My hands were shaking as I wrote down everything I could remember. The rational part of my brain was already trying to find explanations. Atmospheric phenomena, ball lightning, some classified military test I wasn't cleared to know about. But I'd worked at Edwards for 6 months by then. I knew what experimental aircraft looked like, how they moved, what their limitations were. This wasn't that. This was something operating on principles that made our most advanced technology look like stone tools. I drove home in a daze, forgetting entirely about calling Amanda. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those maneuvers in my mind, running through every physics equation I knew, trying to find some framework that could account for what I'd witnessed. The next morning, I filed a report with my supervisor, a man named Dr. Gerald Hendricks. He was in his 50s, career Air Force, with 2 decades of experience in aerospace research. I gave him my notebook, walked him through what I'd observed, showed him my calculations. Dr. Hendricks listened without interrupting. When I finished, he closed the notebook and handed it back to me. "Robert," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you saw a satellite and some atmospheric refraction. Maybe Venus. The human eye can be unreliable at night, especially when you're tired after a long day." I started to protest, to explain that I knew the difference between a satellite and what I'd witnessed. But he raised his hand. "I'm going to pretend we didn't have this conversation," he said. "You're a talented engineer with a promising career. Don't compromise it by filing reports about UFOs. That's not the kind of attention you want here." The message was clear. I thanked him and left his office. But walking back to my workspace, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, something closer to profound isolation. I'd seen something that defied explanation, documented it carefully, and the institutional response was to deny it had happened at all. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the beginning of a journey that would completely reshape my understanding of reality. Because 3 weeks later, I would see the craft again. And this time, it wouldn't just pass overhead, it would land. I'd always been drawn to solitude, even before the sighting. Growing up as an only child in suburban Los Angeles, I'd spent my teenage years reading Asimov and Clarke, dreaming about the stars, feeling more comfortable with mathematics and physics than social dynamics. By my mid-20s, I developed a habit of solo camping trips into the desert whenever work stress built up. Amanda didn't understand it, but she tolerated it. She'd grown up with 4 siblings and couldn't comprehend the appeal of being alone in the wilderness. November 4th, 1983. 3 weeks and 2 days after the sighting at Edwards. I'd driven out to a spot I'd discovered a few months earlier, about 40 miles northeast of Barstow. It wasn't an official campground, just a flat area surrounded by creosote bushes and rock formations, accessible only by a rough dirt road that most passenger vehicles couldn't handle. My truck could manage it, and I'd never encountered another person there. I arrived around 4 p.m., set up my tent, gathered some dead wood for a fire. The routine was meditative. No radio, no other people, just the slow transition from daylight to darkness. I'd brought a stack of technical journals I'd been meaning to read and a thermos of coffee. By 9 p.m., I was sitting beside my small fire, reading an article about boundary layer control in hypersonic flow. The night was cold, probably in the low 40s, but the fire kept me comfortable. There was no moon. The stars were overwhelming. At 9:34 p.m., precisely, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, instantaneously. I felt it like walking into a refrigerator. My breath became visible. I looked up from my journal. The craft was there. Not overhead, not in the distance. There, hovering silently, about 200 yards from my campsite, maybe 30 feet above the desert floor. I'd spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself that what I'd seen at Edwards had been some misidentification, that Dr. Hendricks was right, that I'd let excitement, lights at each corner, not quite white, lights at each corner, not quite white, not quite blue. They didn't flicker or pulse, they just were, absolutely steady. And along the underside, a pattern of smaller lights that seemed to flow in geometric sequences. I should have been terrified. Every survival instinct should have sent me running to my truck. Instead, I stood up, my journal falling from my lap, and I stared. The engineer in me was already observing, cataloging. No visible propulsion system, no exhaust, no sound whatsoever. The air around it seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat distortion, except it was freezing. We stayed like that for maybe 2 minutes. Me standing beside my dying fire, the craft hovering motionless. Then, with the same impossible smoothness I'd witnessed before, it descended. Slowly, deliberately, it settled onto the desert surface with no dust cloud, no impact. It simply came to rest, as if gravity was negotiable. I realized my legs were moving. I was walking toward it, not running away, walking toward it. This was insane. I knew this was insane. But something deeper than fear was driving me. Curiosity, wonder, the same impulse that had made me want to be an engineer in the first place. The need to understand. I covered about half the distance, maybe 100 yards before I stopped. My heart was hammering. My hands were trembling. But I wasn't afraid exactly. I was overwhelmed. Standing that close, I could see details. The surface wasn't metallic, or if it was unlike any metal I knew. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The geometric patterns of smaller lights continued their flow, and I realized they weren't random. They were organized, intentional, mathematical. I stood there, and the craft sat there, and nothing happened. Minutes passed. 5, 10. I didn't move. It didn't move. Then, slowly, I raised my right hand, a gesture of greeting, of acknowledgement. I felt ridiculous doing it, like some scene from a science fiction movie. But I didn't know what else to do. The lights changed. Not dramatically, but the pattern shifted. The flow altered. And somehow I understood this was a response. Not words, not sound, but communication. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, the craft rose again with the same silent smoothness. It ascended to about 100 feet, hovered for perhaps 30 seconds, then accelerated straight up and vanished in less than a heartbeat. The temperature returned to normal instantly. The desert was just desert again. My fire had burned down to embers. I walked back to my campsite on legs that barely supported me and sat down hard on the ground. I didn't sleep that night. I sat beside the fire remains until dawn, watching the sky, replaying every second in my mind. I'd made contact, actual contact, and the craft hadn't left because it was finished observing me. It had left because the encounter had reached some natural conclusion. I packed up my campsite as the sun rose and drove back to Barstow in silence. I didn't tell Amanda. I didn't file a report. I just went back to work on Monday and tried to pretend my entire understanding of reality hadn't fundamentally changed. But I knew I'd go back to that spot. I knew I'd wait for it to return. Because something had started that night. Something that I didn't yet understand but could already feel would define the rest of my life. I returned to those coordinates exactly 2 weeks later. November 18th, 1983. I'd spent the intervening 14 days in a state of controlled obsession, functioning normally at work while my mind constantly circled back to that night. I told Amanda I needed another solo camping trip to clear my head. She was annoyed but didn't argue. Our relationship was already showing cracks, though neither of us was ready to acknowledge it yet. The craft didn't come that night. I waited until dawn, sitting in the cold, watching the stars. Nothing. I felt simultaneously relieved and devastated. Maybe it had been a one-time encounter. Maybe I'd never see it again. But I went back. November 25th, December 2nd, December 9th. Each time driving out to the same location, setting up the same campsite, waiting. I developed a ritual. Arrive before sunset. Set up tent. Build small fire. Wait. On December 16th, it returned. The same instantaneous temperature drop at 10:17 p.m. The same silent appearance. This time, I was ready. I'd brought better equipment. A 35mm camera with high-speed film, a compass, a thermometer, a tape recorder. The craft landed in almost exactly the same spot as before, maybe 15 yards different. I approached again, this time stopping about 75 yards away, close enough to observe details. Far enough that I could still convince myself I could run if needed. I'd thought about this, constantly. How do you communicate with something that might not share any common reference points? I'd read about SETI protocols, about mathematical sequences that might serve as universal language, prime numbers, the Fibonacci sequence. I pulled out a flashlight, military-grade, powerful beam, and I started signaling. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses. Pause. The prime number 3. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the lights on the craft pulsed back. 3 pulses. Perfect synchronization. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I continued. 5 pulses. 7 pulses. 11 pulses. Each time the craft responded with the same pattern. We were communicating. Rudimentary, yes. but real. I spent 2 hours that night in what I can only describe as a conversation using light. I'd signal patterns. The craft would respond. Sometimes it would initiate patterns, and I'd try to respond appropriately. I recorded everything on my tape recorder, narrating what I was doing, what I was seeing. When the craft finally departed around 12:30 a.m., ascending with that same impossible acceleration, I felt something I hadn't felt since those initial weeks at Caltech, when advanced mathematics first started making sense. Connection, understanding, the beginning of a language. Over the next 3 months, the pattern emerged. The craft would return every 73 days, not 72, not 74, 73. I tested this rigorously. I'd mark my calendar and drive out to the coordinates. And it would come. By March 1984, our light-based communication had evolved. I'd started bringing graph paper, sketching geometric patterns, holding them up. The craft would project light patterns onto the desert floor in response. Fractal geometries, mathematical relationships. Sometimes the patterns were ones I recognized. Sometimes they were completely alien, and I'd spend days afterward trying to decode their meaning. I bought books on information, theory, on xenolinguistics, on semiotics. I was teaching myself how to build a language from nothing, and somehow, impossibly, it was working. In June 1984, something shifted. During one encounter, I was attempting to communicate a concept about orbital mechanics, using light patterns to represent elliptical paths. The craft's response wasn't visual, it was internal. An image appeared in my mind, not like imagination, like memory, clear, detailed, undeniable. I saw the solar system from outside, not as a diagram, as a real view. I could see the planets, the asteroid belt, the sun, and I understood, without words, that this was their perspective, how they saw our cosmic neighborhood. I stumbled backward, landing hard on the rocky ground. The image faded. The craft sat silent. I was hyperventilating. This wasn't light patterns anymore. This was direct communication, mind to mind, or mind to whatever. I stood up slowly. "Can you understand me?" I said aloud. My voice sounded strange in the desert silence. "If you can understand what I'm thinking, show me something. Show me Edwards." Another image bloomed in my consciousness. The base, aerial view, perfect detail. I could see the runways, the hangars, even the parking lot where I'd first witnessed the craft months earlier. "Jesus," I whispered. Communication accelerated after that. During each encounter, which I'd now confirmed followed the 73-day cycle with remarkable precision, we'd exchange concepts through this strange hybrid of light patterns and mental imagery. I'd think about a question, and sometimes, not always, I'd receive a response, images. Occasionally, something that felt like emotions, though that might have been my interpretation. I learned to distinguish between different types of responses. Some felt automatic, like algorithmic replies. Others felt more considered, more complex. I started to suspect there was intelligence behind the craft, though I never saw any occupants, never received confirmation of biological beings. By 1985, I'd filled 16 notebooks with encounter documentation, dates, times, weather conditions, communication patterns, sketches of light geometries, transcriptions of the mental images I'd received. I kept everything locked in a safe in my apartment. I'd broken up with Amanda months earlier. She'd sensed I was keeping something from her, and the distance had become insurmountable. My work at Edwards continued. I was promoted to senior engineer. I published papers. I maintained perfect professional functionality, but my real life was happening every 73 days in the Mojave Desert, learning to communicate with something that wasn't supposed to exist. and I was beginning to understand that these encounters weren't random. They were purposeful, patient. The beings, whatever they were teaching me, preparing me for something, but I didn't yet know what. By mid-1985, the encounters had developed into what I can only describe as a protocol, a structure. It wasn't just that the craft appeared every 73 days. It was that each meeting seemed to build on the previous one, like chapters in an ongoing conversation. I'd become more systematic in my approach. I'd arrive at the coordinates at least 2 hours before the expected appearance time, which had settled into a window between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m., varying by only 15 to 20 minutes. I'd set up what I started calling my workspace, a folding table with notebooks, a digital watch I'd synchronized to WWV radio time signals, my camera equipment, and a battery-powered lantern that I'd use for light pattern communication. The craft's arrival had become predictable enough that I could sense it about 30 seconds before the temperature drop. A change in the air pressure, maybe, or some electromagnetic effect I couldn't quantify. The hair on my arms would stand up. The quality of silence would shift. June 8th, 1985 marked a turning point. The craft arrived at 10:07 p.m. By then, we'd established what I thought of as baseline communication. I could project questions through intentional thought, usually accompanied by light patterns or geometric sketches, and I'd receive responses through mental imagery. That night, I'd been thinking about duration. How long had they been observing Earth? I tried to formulate this as a question, sketching timelines on paper, using light pulses to represent years. The response wasn't an image. It was more complex, a sensation of vast time, overlaid with images that flickered past too quickly for me to fully process. Ancient landscapes, ice sheets, forests, oceans, the impression of millennia, maybe longer. You've been watching us for thousands of years, I said aloud. Speaking helped me organize my thoughts, even though I'd confirmed the communication wasn't auditory. Another sensation. Affirmation. Yes. Why? I thought, focusing hard on the question. What's the purpose? This time the response was an image I'd seen before in earlier encounters, but hadn't fully understood. A sphere, but not just a sphere. Layers within it. Complexity. And I realized it was meant to represent something conceptual, not physical. Consciousness, maybe, or civilization, or something we didn't have a word for. Over the next several encounters, I began to understand that their observation wasn't scientific in the way we'd conduct scientific observation. It wasn't about cataloging species or studying primitive cultures. It was something else, something related to what humans were becoming, not what we were. By September 1985, I'd started bringing more sophisticated equipment, a Geiger counter to measure radiation, an EMF meter I'd built myself using plans from an electronics magazine, a spectrum analyzer I'd borrowed from the lab using a dubious excuse about a personal project. The readings were fascinating. The Geiger counter showed normal background radiation, no increase when the craft was present. The EMF meter, however, went wild, not with the regular electromagnetic spectrum, with something else, patterns I couldn't decode but could record on tape. I'd also noticed physical effects on myself. After encounters, I'd have periods of unusual clarity. Mathematical problems that had stumped me at work would suddenly resolve themselves. I'd wake up with solutions to engineering challenges fully formed in my mind. My colleagues started commenting on my productivity, my innovative approaches to propulsion design problems. I wondered if the communication was changing my brain somehow, rewiring neural pathways. I had no way to test this hypothesis safely, but I documented the cognitive effects meticulously. December 1985. I'd been maintaining the encounter cycle for over 2 years. I developed what I thought of as a relationship with the craft, though I still had no clear sense of what or who was directing it. The communication had grown more nuanced. I could transmit more complex concepts. I could receive layered information that included visual imagery, emotional tones, and something that felt like contextual meaning. During the December 19th encounter, I attempted something new. I brought photographs, pictures of my childhood, my parents, my work at Edwards, human faces, human artifacts. I held them up, one by one, thinking about what each represented. The craft's lights pulsed in patterns I'd learned to recognize as attention or interest. Then I received something unexpected, not an image, a question. I felt it as clearly as if someone had spoken aloud, though there were no words. The question was about identity, about the relationship between individual consciousness and collective existence, about whether humans understood themselves as separate or connected. I spent 20 minutes trying to formulate a response, thinking through concepts of individualism, society, culture. The craft seemed to process this, then transmitted another concept, a feeling of sadness, or maybe concern, something close to those emotions, but not quite human in character. That encounter lasted longer than usual, almost 4 hours. When the craft finally departed at 2:34 a.m., I sat in the freezing desert darkness, exhausted and exhilarated. We'd crossed some threshold. The communication had moved from simple information exchange to something more philosophical, more personal. I drove back to my apartment as the sun rose, my mind churning. I'd been maintaining this secret for over 2 years. I hadn't told anyone, not family, not friends, not colleagues. The isolation was becoming difficult, but I couldn't imagine breaking silence. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what then? Government intervention, military seizure of my documentation, the end of the encounters? I'd read enough about Project Blue Book, about the Condon Report, about how the Air Force had systematically dismissed UFO reports throughout the 1950s and 60s. I knew what happened to people who came forward with stories like mine. They were discredited, marginalized. I'd seen it happen to professional pilots, to radar operators, to credible witnesses who'd made the mistake of speaking publicly. So I maintained the protocol. Every 73 days, I drove to the coordinates. The craft came. We communicated. I documented everything. And I waited to understand why this was happening, what purpose it served, what the beings wanted me to know. By early 1986, I'd started to suspect that the encounters were leading somewhere, that there was a destination to this ongoing conversation. The communications had become more urgent, more focused. The beings seemed to be building towards something, preparing me for information they wanted to transmit but couldn't yet, or wouldn't yet. I was right, though I wouldn't understand what they'd been preparing me for until 2003, when they finally answered the question I'd been afraid to ask directly. Why do you stay hidden? Why don't you make contact openly? The answer would change everything, but that revelation was still 17 years away. First, I had to continue learning their language, continue proving I could handle increasingly complex concepts, continue demonstrating that I could be trusted with knowledge that would fundamentally challenge human assumptions about our place in the universe. The protocol continued. Every 73 days, year after year, a secret education conducted in the cold desert darkness, teaching me to think in ways human cognition wasn't designed for. Preparing me for a truth about humanity that, even now, knowing what I know, I struggle to fully accept. The years between 1986 and 1991 passed in a rhythm defined by those 73-day cycles. I'd become senior lead engineer at Edwards, then left in 1988 for a position at a private aerospace contractor in Palmdale. The work was challenging, well compensated, and allowed me flexibility in my schedule. I never married. Maintained a few casual relationships, but nothing that would require explaining my regular desert trips. I developed a cover story for anyone who asked. I was an amateur astronomer. The dark skies in the Mojave were perfect for observation. I even bought a decent telescope and learned enough astronomy to make the lie convincing. Most people lost interest after I started explaining celestial coordinates and apparent magnitude. The encounters continued their evolution. By 1989, the communication had become fluid enough that I could transmit abstract concepts with reasonable confidence they were being understood. I could ask about the craft's propulsion, though the answers came in mathematical frameworks I only partially comprehended. I could inquire about their origin, receiving images of stellar systems I couldn't identify. But they'd never shown me anything about Earth from their perspective. Not really. Not beyond those early aerial views. I'd asked multiple times what they thought of humanity, of human civilization. The responses had always been vague, geometric patterns that might have meant observation or study, emotional tones that felt neutral, clinical. February 7th, 1991. I remember the date precisely because it was 2 days after my 35th birthday. I'd spent that birthday alone, as usual, and I'd been thinking about time, about how I'd devoted nearly 8 years to these encounters, and what I actually had to show for it. Notebooks full of sketches and observations. A private education in communication techniques that had no practical application. A secret that isolated me from normal human connection. The craft arrived at 9:43 p.m. Standard Protocol. Temperature drop. Silent descent. I went through my usual setup, but that night I transmitted something different. Not a question about them. A question about me. Why me? I thought, focusing hard on the concept. Why did you choose to communicate with me specifically? The response was immediate and more forceful than anything I'd received before. Not an image, a sensation. The feeling of being seen, truly seen, examined at a level far deeper than physical observation. And with that sensation came an understanding. I hadn't been chosen randomly. They'd been observing me before that first sighting at Edwards, possibly for years. This should have frightened me. Instead, I felt oddly validated. What did you see in me? I transmitted. Another sensation. Patience. Curiosity. The capacity to adapt. And then, surprisingly, loneliness. They'd recognized me, someone already isolated, someone who wouldn't immediately run to authorities, someone whose solitary nature would protect the secret. You've been studying me, I thought, but I want to understand what you've learned. Show me humanity through your eyes. There was a pause, longer than usual, maybe 2 full minutes where the craft sat silent, lights in their standard pattern. Then the communication shifted in a way I'd never experienced. The image that flooded into my consciousness wasn't singular. It was layered, multidimensional. I saw cities from altitude: New York, Tokyo, Moscow, London, Cairo. I saw them not as static images, but as living systems. Lights, movement, the flow of traffic like blood through arteries. And overlaid on these images was data I couldn't fully process. Numbers, patterns, analysis of some kind. Then the perspective shifted. I saw warfare, bombs falling, soldiers in trenches. This wasn't current. These were historical images. World War II, I thought. Vietnam. Other conflicts I didn't recognize. The emotional tone accompanying these images was complex. Not quite horror, more like puzzlement, incomprehension. Another shift. Art. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Taj Mahal, sculptures I recognized from museums, music somehow transmitted as visual pattern. Beethoven's Ninth, I realized. The emotional tone here was different, something close to appreciation or fascination. More images cascaded through my mind: environmental destruction, clear-cut forests, oil spills. Then, contrasted against this, images of human compassion, a nurse tending to patients, a teacher with children, someone helping a stranger. The being or beings were showing me the full spectrum: the violence and the kindness, the creation and the destruction. I was crying. I realized this only when the cold air stung the tears on my face. The scope of what I was seeing, the depth of observation they'd conducted, was overwhelming. They'd been watching everything, not just governments or militaries, individual humans, ordinary moments of human existence. "How long have you been watching this closely?" I transmitted. The response was that same sensation of vast time, centuries, millennia. They'd witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. They'd observed humans when we were still using stone tools. "And what conclusion have you reached?" I thought. "What do you think of us?" This question hung in the cold air. The craft's lights continued their geometric patterns. Then, finally, a response, but not an answer. A counter-question, transmitted with perfect clarity. "What do you think of yourselves?" I sat with this for a long moment. It wasn't rhetorical. They genuinely wanted to know. How did humans perceive their own nature, their own trajectory? I tried to formulate an answer. We're flawed, I thought. We're violent and self-destructive. But we're also capable of incredible beauty. We're young. We're still learning. Another image appeared. This one was different. I saw human DNA as a spiral, rotating slowly, but it wasn't static. It was changing, evolving. And around it, I saw something else. Energy patterns, waves, something that looked almost like code but wasn't anything I recognized. The emotional tone accompanying this image was significant, intense. This was important. They were trying to show me something fundamental about humanity, something beyond biology, something about human consciousness itself. I received fragments of understanding. Humans were different, not just from them, but from other forms of consciousness they'd encountered. There was something unique about how human minds worked, something about our creativity, our chaos, our unpredictability. The encounter lasted 6 hours that night, the longest by far. Image after image, concept after concept. By the time the craft departed at 3:47 a.m., I was mentally and emotionally exhausted. I sat in my truck as the sun rose, trying to process what I'd been shown. They'd given me a comprehensive overview of their observations, humanity in all its complexity. But the communication had ended with that image of DNA and energy patterns, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the key. This was what they'd really wanted me to understand, that humans were something more than biological organisms, that consciousness itself was the variable they were studying. I drove home and spent the next week reviewing my notes, trying to capture everything I'd experienced. But I knew I'd lost details. The human brain wasn't designed to retain that volume of information transmitted that quickly. I got maybe 30% into my notebooks. The rest faded like dreams. But one thing remained crystal clear. That final image, that sense of something unique about human consciousness. Something that set us apart, and the emotional tone that had accompanied it. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to it. Concern, wariness. They weren't afraid of human violence or technology. They were wary of something deeper, something we ourselves didn't understand. And over the next 12 years of continued encounters, that unease would only grow stronger in their communications. Until finally, in 2003, they'd explain it directly. The 1990s passed in a blur of engineering work and continued encounters. I'd moved up to director of advanced propulsion concepts at my contractor job. I was publishing papers on hypersonic systems, contributing to classified projects I still can't discuss. Professionally, I was successful. Personally, I was a ghost. I had work colleagues, but no real friends. I'd had a few relationships, but they always ended the same way. Partners would eventually ask what I was hiding, what made me so distant. I never had an answer I could give them. The encounters continued every 73 days without fail. I documented over 130 meetings by the year 2000. The communication had become sophisticated enough that we could exchange complex scientific concepts. I'd transmit questions about physics, about the nature of space-time, about faster-than-light travel. Sometimes I'd receive answers, usually in mathematical frameworks that took me months to partially decode. Sometimes the response would be that same sensation of patient redirection, as if they were saying, "That's not the right question." By 2002, I'd begun to notice a shift in tone. The encounters felt more intense. The beings, whatever they were, seemed to communicate with greater urgency. The images I received came faster, more densely packed with information. The emotional undertones were stronger. I was 46 years old. I'd been maintaining this secret for 19 years, and I'd become increasingly aware that the beings were building towards something. Some revelation they'd been preparing me for through years of gradual education. March 3rd, 2003. The encounter started normally. Standard appearance time, 10:21 p.m. Temperature drop. The craft settling into its usual position, about 80 yards from my workspace. We went through our established protocols. I transmitted updates about my life, about technological developments I thought might interest them. They responded with geometric patterns I'd learned to interpret as acknowledgement. Then I asked the question I'd been circling around for years, but had never transmitted directly. "Why do you stay hidden?" I thought, making the concept as clear as possible. "You have the technology to make open contact. You could land in Washington or Moscow or Beijing. You could announce yourselves. End all speculation. Why don't you?" The craft went completely dark. Every light extinguished simultaneously. I'd never seen this before in nearly 20 years of encounters. For about 30 seconds, I sat in total darkness, broken only by my battery lantern. My heart rate accelerated. Had I crossed some boundary? Had I asked something forbidden? Then the lights returned, but different. The usual geometric patterns were replaced by something more organic, flowing, almost biological in appearance. And the communication that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before. I received an image of Earth from space. Beautiful, blue and white and green. But as I watched, the perspective zoomed in, down through atmosphere, down to surface, and I saw cities, billions of humans going about their lives. And overlaid on this image was something else. Energy. Vast networks of energy surrounding the planet. Electromagnetic fields from our technology. Radio waves. Television signals. Satellite communications. A shell of human-generated noise encasing the entire world. Then the perspective shifted again. I saw inside buildings, inside rooms, humans sitting in front of television screens, computer monitors, phones. Millions of humans, billions of humans, connected through these technological networks, receiving information, transmitting information, a constant flow of data and communication. And then I understood what they were showing me. They were asking me a question in return. How do you make contact with the species that's already drowning in information? How do you introduce yourself to a civilization that can't distinguish signal from noise? But that wasn't the complete answer. I felt them redirecting my attention. The image changed again. This time I saw human consciousness itself, represented as patterns of light within human bodies. Millions of these patterns, and they were all different, wildly, chaotically different. No two alike, and more than that, they were constantly changing, shifting, evolving, unpredictable. The emotional tone that accompanied this image was unmistakable. Fear, not terror, but profound unease, wariness. "You're afraid of us?" I transmitted, shocked by the realization. "That's why you stay hidden. You're afraid of humans." The confirmation came immediately. Yes? But why? I thought. We're primitive compared to you. Our technology is centuries behind yours, maybe millennia. What could we possibly do that frightens you? What followed was the most complex communication I'd ever received. It came in layers, in fragments, in concepts that didn't translate cleanly into human thought patterns. I'm going to try to express it in words, but understand that this is a crude approximation of something far more nuanced: human consciousness. They communicated. Wasn't like other forms of consciousness they'd encountered. Most intelligent species developed along relatively predictable paths. Their thought patterns were logical, structured, consistent. They built civilizations based on stable, rational frameworks. Humans were different. Human consciousness was chaotic, creative in ways that defied prediction. We could hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously. We could make intuitive leaps that bypassed logic entirely. We could imagine things that didn't exist and then reshape reality to match our imagination. This wasn't a flaw they tried to convey. It was something far more significant. It was a form of consciousness that could affect reality itself in ways they didn't fully understand. I received an image of human art, music, literature, architecture, all these things that didn't exist until humans imagined them into being. And the beings were trying to show me that this creative capacity wasn't just cultural, it was fundamental to human consciousness. It was literally how our minds interfaced with reality. Then another concept, quantum mechanics, the observer effect, the way that observation itself influences quantum states. And they were suggesting, though I wasn't sure I was interpreting this correctly, that human consciousness had a stronger version of this effect. That human observation, human intention, human belief could influence reality at scales larger than quantum. We're not just observers, I transmitted, testing my understanding. You think we're participants, that we're shaping reality through consciousness itself. Affirmation, yes. But more than that, they showed me historical images, rapid technological development over the past 2 centuries. From horse-drawn carriages to spacecraft in less than a human lifetime. From simple tools to quantum computers. The acceleration was exponential, unprecedented. And they were afraid because they didn't know where it was leading. They didn't know what humans would become, what we were capable of, whether we destroy ourselves or transcend into something they couldn't predict or control. You're afraid of our potential, I thought, the understanding crystallizing. Not what we are, but what we might become. Yes, but also no. The concept was more complicated. They were afraid because we were already becoming it. Whatever humans were evolving into, it had already started. And they couldn't see the end point. The encounter ended shortly after that. The craft departed at 2:14 a.m., leaving me sitting in the cold desert, my mind reeling. For 19 years, I'd thought they were observing us with detached scientific interest. But it wasn't detachment. It was careful distance. The distance you maintain from something powerful and unpredictable. I drove home as dawn broke, playing the encounter over and over in my mind. They feared us. These beings with technology, centuries beyond ours, feared humanity. Not because we were violent, though we were. not because we were destructive, though we were that too. They feared us because human consciousness itself was something anomalous, something that could reshape reality in ways even they couldn't fully predict or control. And we didn't even know we could do it. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. We were wielding this capacity unconsciously, blindly, without understanding what we were or what we were becoming. The implications were staggering, and I had no one I could talk to about them. No one who would believe me. No one who could help me process what I'd learned. So I did what I'd always done. I documented it. I filled notebook after notebook, trying to capture the concepts. And I waited for the next encounter, hoping for clarity, for deeper understanding. The beings had answered my question about why they stayed hidden. But in doing so, they'd opened up far more profound questions. Questions about the nature of human consciousness, about humanity's future, about what we were capable of if we ever learned to consciously direct the capacity they feared. Those questions would dominate the encounters for the next 20 years. And the answers I'd gradually receive would be even more unsettling than the revelation that we were feared. The encounters between 2003 and 2010 became increasingly focused on one central theme: human consciousness and its unique properties. The beings seemed determined to help me understand not just that we were different, but how and why that difference made us dangerous. Dangerous not in the conventional sense of weapons or aggression, but dangerous in a far more fundamental way. May 15th, 2004. I was 48 years old, and the pattern had held for over 20 years. The craft arrived at 9:56 p.m. By then, I'd spent the past year trying to understand the implications of what I'd learned. I'd read everything I could find on consciousness studies, quantum mechanics, observer effects, even fringe theories about consciousness affecting reality. None of it quite matched what the beings had tried to communicate. That night, I transmitted a direct question. Show me specifically what you mean about human consciousness affecting reality. Give me concrete examples. The response was immediate. I received an image of human technological development, but viewed from a perspective I'd never considered. They showed me the Industrial Revolution, not as a gradual process, but as a sudden inflection point. Human civilization had existed for thousands of years at relatively stable technological levels. Then, in less than 2 centuries, we'd gone from agrarian societies to nuclear weapons and space travel. The beings weren't suggesting this was purely technological advancement. They were showing me that the acceleration happened because humans collectively began to believe it was possible. The shift wasn't in resources or knowledge alone. It was in human consciousness deciding that reality could be different and then making it so. They showed me inventors: Edison, Tesla, the Wright brothers. But they weren't showing me the inventions. They were showing me the moment of conception, the instant when these individuals imagined something that didn't exist, believed it could exist, and then forced reality to accommodate that belief through action and will. Imagination made manifest, I transmitted, testing my interpretation. Yes? But the concept went deeper. They showed me quantum experiments, the double-slit experiment specifically, how observation collapsed probability waves into definite states. Then they showed me something I couldn't quite understand. Human consciousness doing something similar but at macro scales, not just affecting particles but affecting probability itself at the level of events, outcomes, reality. I received an impression of mathematics, probability distributions, and overlaid on these, human intention creating bias and outcomes. Not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently, measurably if you knew how to look for it. You're saying human belief influences probability? I thought. that we're unconsciously making unlikely things more likely just by expecting them? The confirmation came with a qualifier. Not all humans equally, not all the time, but collectively, yes, and increasingly so. They showed me human population growth. 1 billion in 1800, 2 billion by 1927, 7 billion by 2000. Each new human consciousness adding to the collective effect. Each one another node in a network that was gaining influence over reality itself. Is this happening with other species? I asked. Other intelligent life you've encountered? No. The response was definitive. Other species developed consciousness that observed and understood reality. Humans developed consciousness that participated in reality's creation. The distinction was fundamental. Over the next several encounters, they tried to show me the mechanism, though I'm not sure I ever fully grasped it. It had something to do with how human brains processed information, the way we could imagine fictional scenarios and treat them as temporarily real, the way we could hold contradictory thoughts simultaneously, the way our consciousness seemed to exist partially outside linear time, remembering the past and simulating the future. June 27, 2006. This encounter started with an unusual question from them. They transmitted images of human religion, churches, temples, mosques, rituals, prayer, and they wanted to know what were humans doing when they prayed. I tried to explain belief, faith, the idea of communicating with divine beings, but they redirected my attention. They showed me prayer not as communication, but as focused intention. Millions of humans, across thousands of years, practicing techniques for concentrating consciousness and directing it toward desired outcomes. You think prayer actually works? I transmitted, shocked. Not because God's answer, but because focused human consciousness influences probability. The response was complex. Prayer worked, but not in the way humans believed. It wasn't supernatural. It was natural. It was humans unconsciously accessing this capacity to influence reality through focused consciousness. Religion had accidentally developed techniques for doing it, then wrapped those techniques in supernatural explanations. Does it matter what they believe? I asked. If they think they're talking to God, but they're actually affecting reality through consciousness, does the belief system matter? Yes and no. The beings showed me that belief was the mechanism. The specific content of the belief mattered less than the strength and focus of it. A person convinced they were invoking divine intervention was actually invoking their own latent capacity to influence probability. The religious framework just gave them permission to believe it would work. August 9, 2007. I asked the question that had been building for years. If humans have this capacity, why don't we use it deliberately? Why don't we know about it? The answer was both simple and terrifying. We did use it deliberately, all the time, just not consciously. Every decision, every action, every creative act was humans exercising this capacity without recognizing it for what it was. We were like infants with loaded weapons, immensely powerful but completely unaware of our own power. And the beings were afraid because they'd seen what happened when species discovered this capacity consciously. They showed me images I couldn't quite interpret. Other worlds, other civilizations. Most had destroyed themselves. A few had transcended into something the beings couldn't follow or understand. None had remained stable and unchanged. What happens if humans figure this out? I transmitted. If we learn to use this consciously? Unknown. That was the answer. Unknown. And that uncertainty was what frightened them. Humans were already unstable, already prone to conflict and irrationality. If we gained conscious control over reality shaping consciousness, the results could be catastrophic. We might destroy ourselves, We might destroy others. We might break reality itself in ways they couldn't predict or repair. But we might also transcend, I thought, become something better. Yes, that was also possible. But they'd been observing humanity for thousands of years, and they weren't optimistic about our trajectory. They showed me wars, environmental destruction, inequality, suffering, all the evidence of a species that hadn't learned to manage its own nature, suddenly approaching the threshold of conscious reality manipulation. November the 21st, 2008. This encounter focused on the timeline. They showed me probability curves, though I'm translating complex mathematical concepts into crude approximations. Humanity was approaching what they called a bifurcation point, a moment where our collective consciousness would either stabilize and transcend or collapse into chaos. When? I transmitted. The answer was imprecise. Decades, not centuries. Within my lifetime, possibly. The exponential acceleration of human technology, human population, human interconnection through digital networks was pushing us toward this threshold faster than they'd anticipated. What can we do? I asked. How do we ensure we choose the right path? They didn't know. That was the honest answer. They didn't know because humanity was unique, because our form of consciousness didn't have precedent, because the outcome depended on choices we hadn't made yet. But they emphasized one thing: awareness was critical. If humans approached this threshold unconsciously, blind to our own nature and capacity, the outcome would almost certainly be catastrophic. If we could somehow become aware, understand what we were before the critical moment arrived, we might have a chance. That's why you've been teaching me, I realized. You want me to help humanity understand. The confirmation was strong, yes, but also cautious. The information couldn't be released carelessly. Most humans would dismiss it. Many would misuse it. Some would try to weaponize it. The message had to be delivered carefully, at the right time, to people who could process it without destroying themselves or others. I sat in the desert that night, watching the craft depart at 1:47 a.m., understanding finally why this had been such a long, patient education. They weren't just teaching me about them. They were teaching me about us, about what humans really were beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, about the immense and terrifying potential we carried without understanding it. And they were trusting me, in some sense, to find a way to help humanity understand before it was too late. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. I was one person, an aerospace engineer with notebooks full of impossible encounters. Who would listen to me? Who would believe? And even if they did, how could I explain something this complex, this fundamental, without sounding completely insane? Those questions would haunt me for the next 15 years, until my cancer diagnosis forced a decision I'd been avoiding, until I realized that silence had become more dangerous than speaking, until I understood that dying with this knowledge unshared was a betrayal, not just of the beings who taught me, but of humanity itself. The encounters after 2010 took on an increasingly urgent character. The beings were no longer just explaining, they were warning. The mathematical models they'd been developing, the probability curves tracking human development, were showing an acceleration towards the bifurcation point that exceeded their previous estimates. January 12th, 2011. I was 54 years old. I'd been maintaining this secret for 27 years. The craft arrived at 10:33 p.m., and immediately the communication felt different, more forceful, less patient. They showed me images of human technological development over the past decade, the rise of the internet, social media, smartphones. Billions of humans suddenly connected in real-time networks, sharing information, sharing consciousness in ways that hadn't existed before. And they were showing me that this wasn't just communication technology. It was consciousness technology. It was billions of human minds linking together, creating something larger than individual awareness. The impression I received was that this interconnection was accelerating the timeline. The bifurcation point wasn't decades away anymore. It was closer, maybe much closer. How close? I transmitted. The response was imprecise, but the range was sobering. 10 to 20 years, possibly less. Humanity was approaching the threshold at exponential speed, and most humans had no idea it was happening. They showed me what the bifurcation looked like from their perspective. Two probability branches diverging from a single point. One branch led to what I can only describe as transcendence. Humanity evolving into something that integrated its reality-shaping consciousness deliberately, harmoniously. The other branch led to collapse, not necessarily extinction, but a catastrophic failure of collective consciousness that would set humanity back centuries, maybe millennia. What determines which branch we take? I asked. The answer was complex. It had to do with human self-awareness, with whether enough humans understood what they were, what they could do, before the critical moment. It was like a species-wide awakening that had to happen within a specific time window. Too early, and the knowledge would be misused by those not ready for it. Too late, and the bifurcation would occur before humanity could consciously navigate it. March 26, 2012. This encounter focused on the specifics of how human consciousness was already beginning to affect reality in detectable ways. They showed me financial, markets, the way that collective human belief and fear created boom-bust cycles that didn't follow rational models. Economists called these anomalies. The beings were showing me they were consciousness effects, millions of humans unconsciously influencing probability in their favor, creating feedback loops that generated artificial realities. They showed me political movements, the way that collective belief could make the improbable happen. They weren't endorsing any particular ideology, just demonstrating that when enough humans believed something would happen, probability shifted to accommodate that belief. Elections that defied predictions, social movements that succeeded against impossible odds. These weren't random chance. They were probability manipulation through collective consciousness. We're already doing it, I transmitted. We're already affecting reality. We just don't realize we're doing it. Yes, and that unconscious use was becoming more powerful as humans became more interconnected. The internet wasn't just connecting computers. It was creating resonance between human consciousnesses. When millions of people focused on the same idea simultaneously, the reality-shaping effect was enormous. Is this dangerous? I asked. Very. Because unconscious use was chaotic. It created feedback loops humans didn't understand. It generated unintended consequences. It was like children playing with nuclear weapons, having no idea what the buttons did. June 8th, 2014. I was 58. My hair had gone completely gray. I developed arthritis in my hands. The years of night driving to the remote desert locations were taking their toll. But the encounters continued with the same precise 73-day rhythm they'd maintained for 3 decades. This meeting focused on specific warning signs, ways to recognize that humanity was approaching the bifurcation point. They showed me patterns to watch for, increasing synchronicities, more frequent occurrence of improbable events, growing disconnect between predicted outcomes and actual outcomes across multiple domains. Reality becoming, in their terms, more plastic, more responsive to collective human consciousness. Are we seeing these signs now? I transmitted. Yes, they were already manifesting. Not dramatically enough that most humans would notice, but detectable if you knew what to look for. Statistical anomalies, pattern breaks, probability distributions that didn't match historical models. "How much time do we have?" I asked again. 5 to 15 years. The range had narrowed. Somewhere in that window, humanity would hit the bifurcation point, and the outcome would depend on whether we'd learned what we were before that moment arrived. September 20th, 2016. The communication that night was the most direct warning I'd received. The beings showed me that they couldn't intervene. This wasn't a prime directive or ethical restriction. It was practical. Their intervention would affect the outcome in unpredictable ways. Human consciousness would respond to open contact by reshaping reality around that event, and they couldn't model what that would look like. It might trigger the positive transcendence. It might trigger the catastrophic collapse. They didn't know, and they weren't willing to risk it. "So we're on our own," I transmitted. Yes, but also no. They could observe. They could warn. They could educate individuals like me who might be able to help humanity understand. But they couldn't make the choice for us. The bifurcation was humanity's crisis to navigate, our evolution to consciously direct or unconsciously fumble. "What happens to you if we collapse?" I asked. "If we choose the negative branch?" They showed me withdrawal. Quarantine. Humanity would be left to rebuild over centuries while they maintained a distance. It wasn't cruelty. It was safety. A species that had collapsed from misuse of reality-shaping consciousness was dangerous even in its diminished state. They'd have to wait until we'd forgotten the capacity entirely before approaching again. And if we transcend? This response was harder to interpret. Partnership, maybe. Or at least communication between equals. Humans who consciously understood their nature could interact with other conscious species without the danger of unconscious reality manipulation. We'd become part of a larger community of awareness. December 3rd, 2018. I was 62. I'd started noticing the signs they'd warned me about. Improbable election outcomes, financial markets behaving erratically, social movements that defied conventional models. Reality was becoming more responsive to collective human belief. And most people were explaining these anomalies with political or economic theories that missed the deeper pattern. That night, they transmitted what felt like a final, comprehensive warning. The bifurcation was close. Within 5 years, probably, maybe less. Humanity needed to wake up to its own nature immediately, or the window would close. "What should I do?" I transmitted. "I'm one person. I have notebooks no one will believe. How am I supposed to help humanity understand something this fundamental?" They didn't have a specific answer, but they emphasized that the message was more important than the messenger. That truth had a way of finding receptive minds. That I didn't need to convince everyone, just reach the people who could understand and help spread the awareness. I'm running out of time, I thought, not referring to the bifurcation, but to my own mortality. I'm 62 years old. I can't do this forever. I received an impression of acknowledgement. They knew. They'd been monitoring my health along with everything else, and they understood that my time to act was limited. The encounter ended at 2:21 a.m. The craft departed with the same silent grace it had displayed for 35 years. I sat in the darkness afterward, feeling the weight of what I'd been told. Humanity was approaching a moment that would define its future for centuries, possibly millennia. And I was supposed to help prepare us for it with nothing but an incredible story and decades of documentation that could easily be dismissed as delusion. The next encounter would be my last for a while, not because they stopped coming, but because I would stop being able to make the drive, because in February 2023, I'd received my cancer diagnosis, and everything would change. February 14th, 2023, Valentine's Day. I remember the irony of receiving a terminal diagnosis on a day meant to celebrate life and love. The oncologist was gentle but direct. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. It had already metastasized to my liver. Treatment options were limited. Palliative care. Maybe 6 to 8 months. A year if I was lucky. I sat in that sterile office, listening to words like aggressive and inoperable, and my mind went to the desert, to the craft, to 40 years of encounters that had defined my existence more thoroughly than any relationship, any career achievement, any human experience. I was dying, and the secret I'd carried for 4 decades would die with me unless I made a choice. The most recent encounter had been January the 23rd, 2023, 22 days before my diagnosis. I'd driven to the coordinates, as I'd done over 500 times since 1983. The craft had come. We'd communicated through our established protocols. They'd transmitted more warning signs, more urgency. The bifurcation was imminent. Within the next 2 years, they estimated. Humanity was already showing symptoms of approaching the threshold. Reality was becoming increasingly plastic, increasingly responsive to collective consciousness. I don't know how to tell them, I transmitted that night. I've spent 40 years learning this, and I still barely understand it. How do I make anyone else understand in the time we have left? The response had been what it always was. Tell the truth. Document everything. Trust that the right people will hear it. But there was something else that night. An emotional tone I hadn't felt before. Sadness, maybe. Or respect. They knew I was failing physically. They knew my time was running short. After the diagnosis, I didn't drive to the desert for the next scheduled encounter. For the first time in 40 years, I broke the pattern. I was in treatment, poisoning my body with chemotherapy that might buy me a few extra months. I was weak, nauseated, barely able to walk from my bedroom to the bathroom. But on April 6, 2023, exactly 73 days after the last encounter, something happened. I was lying in bed around 10 p.m. when I felt it. That familiar sensation of changed air pressure, the temperature drop. And I knew, somehow, that the craft was outside my house, not in the desert. Here. I struggled to the window, my hands shaking from illness, not fear. And there it was, hovering silently above my backyard, the same triangular shape. Same lights. After 40 years, they'd come to me. I didn't receive complex communications that night. Just a simple message, transmitted with perfect clarity. Time is short. For you. For humanity. Tell the story. The craft stayed for maybe 5 minutes. Then it ascended and disappeared. I haven't seen it since. That was 9 months ago as I write this. I've missed 2 subsequent 73-day cycles. They haven't come back to the desert. I think that was their farewell, their final instruction. So I'm telling the story. I'm speaking now because I have perhaps 2 months left. Because the beings were right about the timeline. Because I'm seeing the signs they warned me about everywhere I look. Because humanity is approaching the bifurcation point and we're doing it blind, unaware of what we are or what's at stake. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I don't expect most people to believe me. But the beings taught me something important over 4 decades of patient communication. Truth doesn't require universal acceptance. It requires reaching the minds that can process it, understand it, and help spread that understanding to others. There are people reading this now, or watching this, or however you're receiving this message, who already sense what I'm talking about. Who've noticed reality becoming strange in ways they can't quite articulate. Who've experienced synchronicities that feel too consistent to be coincidence. Who've felt the growing power of collective belief to shape events. You know something is happening. You just didn't have a framework to understand it. This is that framework. Human consciousness isn't just passive observation. It's active participation in reality's creation. We've had this capacity all along, but we're becoming more powerful as we become more interconnected. And we're approaching a moment where we either learn to use this capacity consciously and constructively, or we collapse under the weight of unconscious, chaotic reality manipulation. The beings who've been observing us for millennia are afraid of us. Not because we're violent, though we are. Not because we're destructive, though we are that too. They're afraid because we're powerful in ways we don't understand, and we're about to become much more so. They can't intervene. They can only watch and hope we figure it out in time. I'm leaving this testimony along with 40 years of documentation, notebooks, photographs, audio recordings, mathematical sequences, everything I could preserve. I'm trusting that someone will examine it seriously, that someone will look past the incredible nature of the story and consider the implications if even part of it is true. We're not alone in the universe. We've never been alone, but we are unique. We're consciousness that can reshape reality, and we're standing at the threshold of either transcending into something extraordinary or collapsing into chaos. The choice is ours, but only if we make it consciously, only if we understand what we are before the moment of decision arrives. I'm dying. The cancer is winning, but I'm not afraid. I've spent 40 years in communication with beings who exist far beyond human understanding, and they've taught me that consciousness doesn't end. It transforms. It continues. What I'm afraid of is humanity missing this opportunity, missing our chance to evolve consciously because we were too skeptical, too divided, too distracted to hear the warning. That would be the real tragedy. Not that I die with this secret, but that we all suffer because we couldn't accept what we are in time to navigate what's coming. So this is my final message, my confession, my warning. Believe it or not, as you choose. But at least consider the possibility. Consider that reality might be more responsive to consciousness than we've been taught. Consider that humanity might be approaching a transformative moment. Consider that we might need to wake up to our own nature before it's too late. The beings can't save us. This is our choice, our moment, our evolution to consciously direct. I hope we choose wisely. I hope we wake up in time. And I hope that someday when humanity has transcended this threshold, someone will remember that a dying engineer tried to tell them the truth. Tried to share what he'd learned in 4 decades of desert meetings with consciousness beyond our understanding. Tried to help us understand what we really are before the moment of decision arrived.